In the shadows of Pittsburgh's steel mills, where smoke rose like prayers into the gray sky, one man built an empire so quiet and so careful that even the FBI didn't know he existed for decades. While Al Capone made headlines and John Gotti craved the spotlight, John LaRocca became something far more dangerous, invisible. This is the story of the most successful mob boss you've never heard of. A man who died in his own bed after 30 years of absolute power, while his rivals died in barbershops and back alleys. This is the story of Big John LaRocca, the silent Godfather. Before we dive into this incredible true story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Are you winding down after a long day? Trying to fall asleep? Drop a comment below, and if you love deep dive gangster stories that help you relax, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Give this video a like if you're ready for a journey through one of America's most secretive crime families. Now let's begin. To understand John LaRocca, we must first understand Sicily in the late 19th century, a place where survival required a particular set of skills, a particular way of seeing the world, a particular code that would later be known simply as La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. Giovanni LaRocca, he wouldn't become John until America, was born on May 1, 1901 in Villarosa, a small town in the province of Enna, right in the heart of Sicily. Some documents suggest December 19, 1901 as his birth date, but May 1st appears more consistently in historical records and would later appear on his official documents in America. Villarosa sits in Sicily's mountainous interior, far from the coastal cities where tourists would later flock. This was not the Sicily of beautiful beaches and tourist hotels. This was the Sicily of grinding poverty, of peasants working land they would never own, of ancient feuds that could span generations, of a distrust for authority so deep it had become woven into the cultural DNA. The town's name means Pink City, but there was nothing rosy about life there in 1901. Sicily had been unified with Italy only 40 years earlier, and the unification had brought little benefit to the island's poor. The Italian government in Rome was distant, corrupt, and viewed Sicilians as barely civilized. Taxes were heavy, opportunities were non-existent. For most families in Villarosa, the choice was stark: stay and struggle, or risk everything on a journey to America. But Sicily gave its children something that could prove invaluable in the New World: omerta. This wasn't just a code of silence, though that's how it's often simplified. Omerta was a complete worldview, a way of understanding power, loyalty, respect, and survival, even as a boy. Giovanni would witness the subtleties of power in Villarosa. He saw neighbors settle disputes with quiet threats rather than open confrontation, and families protect their own with an almost instinctual secrecy. One story passed through the village involved a local land dispute that had lasted decades. Brothers against cousins. Secrets whispered at night. Debts remembered and repaid long after the original insult. Giovanni didn't fully understand it at the time, but he absorbed the lesson. In Sicily, patience and perception often outweighed brute strength. Survival required knowing who to trust and when to say nothing at all. It meant you didn't cooperate with authorities, not because you were protecting criminals necessarily, but because authority itself was not to be trusted. It meant you handled your own problems. It meant your word was your bond, and a man who broke his word was less than nothing. It meant that family, both blood family and chosen family, came before everything else. The LaRocca family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't the poorest either. John's father worked, probably as a farmer or tradesman. They were siblings. The records are unclear on exact numbers, as was common for poor Sicilian families of the era. What is clear is that by 1910, the LaRocca's had made a decision that millions of other Italian families were making. They would leave everything they knew and sail to America. The decision wasn't made lightly. The voyage across the Atlantic was dangerous. Disease was common in the cramped steerage compartments where poor immigrants traveled. And America, while promising opportunity, was also known to be hostile to Italians. The newspapers were full of stories about discrimination, about Italian immigrants being lynched in the South, about the poverty of the tenements in New York and Chicago. But in Sicily, there was no future. In America, there was at least a chance. Imagine being 9 years old and leaving the only home you've ever known. Imagine the journey, weeks at sea in the crowded, stinking belly of a ship, surrounded by hundreds of other immigrants speaking a dozen different languages. Everyone sick, everyone scared, everyone hoping that the gamble would pay off. Young Giovanni LaRocca arrived at Ellis Island in 1910 with his family, like millions of others. They were processed through the Great Hall, examined by doctors, questioned by officials who often couldn't pronounce their names correctly. The LaRocca name survived the immigration process intact. Some families weren't so lucky. Their names mangled into something unrecognizable by clerks who couldn't be bothered to get it right. But unlike the majority of Italian immigrants who settled in New York, Boston, or Philadelphia, the LaRocca's continued west to Pennsylvania. They settled in Indiana County, northeast of Pittsburgh, in coal mining country. This wasn't the glamorous America that had been sold to them. Indiana County in 1910 was grim, industrial, dangerous. The landscape was dominated by coal mines, black wounds in the earth that seemed to swallow men whole. The towns were small, dirty, and divided along ethnic lines. The Americans, meaning the descendants of earlier British and German immigrants, controlled the good jobs and the political power. The newer immigrants, Italians, Poles, Slavs, Hungarians, got the dangerous work that nobody else wanted. And the most dangerous work of all was coal mining. The LaRocca family, like most immigrant families, needed every member to contribute to survival. While the exact timeline is unclear, young Giovanni, now being called John, would have started working as soon as he was physically able. In the coal mining towns of early 20th century Pennsylvania, that meant as young as 10 or 11 years old, working as a breaker boy or in other auxiliary roles before graduating to the actual mining. Coal mining in this era was brutal beyond modern comprehension. Men descended hundreds of feet into the earth in rickety elevators, then spent 12 to 14 hours a day in cramped, dark tunnels, breathing coal dust with every breath. John's days in the mines began before the sun rose. The metallic echo of picks against coal, the choking dust that turned his throat black, and the ever-present danger of collapsing tunnels were constant companions. He watched older miners cough until they could barely breathe, their hands scarred and stiff from years of labor. Each day was a lesson in endurance and observation. The shadows in the tunnels hid dangers as well as opportunities. Even as a child, John learned to read men's expressions, to anticipate moments of panic, and to recognize when silence was the safest weapon. Skills that would serve him far better outside the mines than any pick or shovel ever could. Cave-ins were common. Gas explosions killed dozens at a time, and the pay was barely enough to survive on, with the mining companies paying in scrip that could only be spent at company stores that charged inflated prices. For young John LaRocca, this was his introduction to American capitalism. He saw his father and the other immigrant men come home black with coal dust, their bodies bent and broken by the work. He saw the company bosses fat and comfortable, living in fine houses while the workers lived in shacks. He saw the foremen, often immigrants themselves who had clawed their way up, betraying their own people for a little extra money and power. He saw the politicians taking bribes from the mining companies while giving speeches about American opportunity. These observations, these lessons, would shape everything that came after. The immigrant neighborhoods in the coal towns were tight-knit communities of necessity. Italians lived near Italians. They spoke Italian at home, went to Catholic churches where Italian priests said Mass, shopped at Italian stores, married other Italians. This wasn't just cultural preservation. It was survival. The outside world was hostile. Inside the Italian community, there was at least mutual support. But these communities also brought old world problems to the new world. Feuds from Sicily sometimes continued in Pennsylvania, and the Sicilian tradition of handling problems outside the official legal system, because who could trust the police or the courts, meant that certain men began to acquire reputations as problem solvers, as men of respect, as men who could be turned to when the authorities wouldn't or couldn't help. Young John LaRocca was paying attention to all of this. He was learning English, adapting to American ways. But he never forgot the Sicilian values his parents had brought across the ocean. He understood that in a world that didn't want you, that saw you as less than human, you survived by building your own systems, your own networks, your own codes. He was also learning that legitimate work, breaking your back in the coal mines for pennies, was a sucker's game. There had to be another way. By his late teens, John LaRocca had left school, if he had attended much school at all, and was working as a coal miner. The work was as brutal as it had appeared when he was a child. His body was young and strong, but he could see his future in the bent, coughing, prematurely aged men around him. This wasn't a life, it was a slow death. The year 1922 would change everything. The historical record here is sparse, as it often is with criminal convictions from this era, especially for relatively minor crimes involving working-class immigrants. What we know is this: at age 20, John LaRocca was arrested and charged with assault on a young woman. The specific details of the incident have been lost to time, but the outcome is clear. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in state prison. This was a serious charge, a serious sentence. Whatever happened, it was not a minor scuffle or misunderstanding. The justice system of 1922, especially in Pennsylvania coal country, was not known for being harsh on young white men for trivial offenses. A 3-year sentence meant something significant had occurred. LaRocca entered the Pennsylvania state prison system as a young man in 1922. He would emerge in 1925 fundamentally changed. Prison in the 1920s was nothing like the relatively regulated institutions of today. Brutality was common. Guards were corrupt. Violence between inmates was frequent. But for a young man with intelligence and the right connections, prison could also be an education. And not the kind the state intended to provide. In prison, LaRocca encountered men who had made crime a profession. Not desperate men committing crimes of passion or poverty, but men who had studied the criminal arts, who had systems and connections and philosophies. In the Pennsylvania prison system of the 1920s, Italian organized crime was already well established, and the prisons were full of men connected to various criminal enterprises. LaRocca learned several crucial lessons during his incarceration. First, he learned the value of connections. In prison, as on the streets, it wasn't what you knew but who you knew. The men who thrived behind bars were the ones with powerful friends on the outside, the ones who were part of organizations that could protect them and provide for them. Second, he learned discipline. The men who survived prison with their dignity and sanity intact were the ones who could control themselves, who didn't let anger or impulse guide their actions, who played the long game. Third, and most importantly, he learned the value of silence. The men who got additional charges, who got their sentences extended, who made their situations worse, were the ones who talked too much. The men who kept their mouths shut, who invoked their Fifth Amendment rights, who never informed on anyone, no matter what. These were the men who were respected, who were trusted, who were brought into the inner circles of power. John LaRocca was a quick study. By the time he emerged from prison in 1925, he had connections to Pittsburgh's organized crime elements. He had a reputation for being solid, for keeping his mouth shut, for following orders. And he had made a decision. He would never go back to the coal mines, whatever it took, whatever he had to do. He would find another way. He couldn't have known it then. But his brief time in prison had set him on a path that would lead to 3 decades of absolute power over one of America's most secretive crime families. The assault conviction that might have ruined another man's life had instead given John LaRocca his criminal education. He was 24 years old. He had a felony conviction. He had no legitimate job prospects. But he had something more valuable: a network, a code, and a growing understanding of how power really worked in America. The stage was set for his rise when John LaRocca emerged from prison in 1925. He stepped into an America that had been transformed. The 18th Amendment had been ratified in 1919, and the Volstead Act had followed in 1920, making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages illegal throughout the United States. The noble experiment of prohibition had created the greatest criminal opportunity in American history. Overnight, an enormous legal industry brewing. Distilling, saloons, restaurants, entertainment venues had been forced underground. But the demand for alcohol hadn't disappeared. Americans still wanted to drink. They wanted to drink a lot. And they were willing to pay criminal organizations to provide what the government had made illegal. For organized crime, prohibition was a gift from heaven. The profit margins were enormous. The customer base was huge and respectable. Drinking wasn't seen as morally wrong by most Americans. So middle-class and even upper-class citizens were willing to become customers of criminal enterprises. And the competition, at least initially, was disorganized and amateurish in cities across America. Criminal organizations rapidly professionalized and expanded. Nowhere was this more true than in the Italian-American communities, where men with connections to the old Sicilian Mafia quickly recognized the opportunity in New York. Lucky Luciano and his associates were building what would become the modern American Mafia. In Chicago, Al Capone was becoming the most famous criminal in American history. And in Pittsburgh, a series of ambitious men were fighting for control of what would become one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in the country. Pittsburgh in the 1920s was a booming industrial city. The steel mills ran 24 hours a day, filling the sky with smoke and the air with the smell of molten metal. Hundreds of thousands of workers, many of them immigrants, toiled in the mills, the coal mines, the railroads, the factories. These were men who did hard, dangerous work, and after their shifts, they wanted a drink. Prohibition made that simple desire into a criminal act, and criminal organizations were happy to oblige. LaRocca, fresh out of prison with a felony conviction, couldn't simply walk into a legitimate job. But in the world of bootlegging, his prison connections were an asset, not a liability. He knew men who knew men. He had proven he could keep his mouth shut. He was young, strong, and smart. He took a job as a shoemaker. This would be his official occupation, his cover, his explanation for where his money came from. In reality, he was beginning to work in the bootlegging operations that were rapidly spreading through Pittsburgh's Italian neighborhoods. The bootlegging business in Pittsburgh operated on several levels. At the top were the bosses, the men with the connections to get large quantities of alcohol, whether smuggled in from Canada, produced in illegal stills, or diverted from legal industrial alcohol supplies and redistilled for drinking. In the middle were the distributors, the men who transported the alcohol and sold it to speakeasies and individual customers. At the bottom were the street-level operators, the men who ran the speakeasies, who paid off the cops, who handled the day-to-day risks. LaRocca started somewhere in the middle, learning the business from the ground up. He was making connections, proving himself reliable, and most importantly, watching and learning. Because while bootlegging was profitable, it was also dangerous. Not from the law. The police in Pittsburgh, as in most cities, were easily bribed. And prohibition was so unpopular that juries often refused to convict. The danger came from other criminal organizations. Pittsburgh in the 1920s was in the midst of a mob war. To understand John LaRocca's approach to organized crime, you have to understand what he witnessed during the Prohibition era. He saw, in vivid detail, what happened to men who were too violent, too flashy, too ambitious too quickly. The Pittsburgh crime family in the 1920s was not the quiet, disciplined organization it would later become. It was a chaotic, violent mess. The first boss LaRocca would have known of was Stefano Monastero, a Sicilian immigrant who had risen to power in the 1910s. Monastero controlled bootlegging, gambling, and other rackets in Pittsburgh's Italian neighborhoods. He was the classic old-style mafia boss, violent, autocratic, demanding absolute loyalty. On August 6, 1929, Stefano Monastero walked out of St. John's Hospital in Pittsburgh after visiting a relative. It was late afternoon, still light out. As Monastero approached his car, two men stepped out from behind a wall. They opened fire with pistols, shooting him multiple times. Monastero collapsed on the sidewalk. He was dead before anyone could help him. The murder was never officially solved, but everyone in the underworld knew what had happened. Monastero had been challenged by Giuseppe Siragusa, another ambitious Sicilian who wanted control of the Pittsburgh rackets. With Monastero dead, Siragusa took over. Young John LaRocca, working his way up through the organization, watched and learned. Lesson 1. Being the boss makes you a target. Giuseppe Siragusa's reign lasted less than 2 years. On September 13, 1931, Siragusa was in his home in the Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh. It was morning, and he was performing his daily ritual, shaving in front of the mirror in his bathroom. His wife was in another room. Siragusa heard a noise, started to turn, and then bullets tore through him. The killers had entered through the back door. Either it was unlocked, or they had a key. They shot Siragusa multiple times with a .38 caliber revolver, killing him almost instantly. Then simply walked out once again. The murder was never officially solved, but once again, everyone knew. The leading suspect was John Bazzano, another ambitious Sicilian who believed he should be boss. Bazzano took control of the family after Siragusa's murder. LaRocca, still relatively low in the organization, watched and learned. Lesson 2. Violence creates cycles of revenge. John Bazzano's time at the top would be even shorter than Siragusa's, and his end would be more dramatic. Bazzano faced opposition from the Volpe brothers, James, Joseph, and Arthur, who controlled some bootlegging operations and didn't want to submit to his authority. The disputes simmered through the summer of 1932. Bazzano decided to solve the problem permanently. On July 29, 1932, Bazzano invited the three Volpe brothers to a supposed peace meeting at a coffee shop in the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh. When the brothers arrived, Bazzano's men were waiting. The Volpes were forced into a car at gunpoint and driven to a house that Bazzano controlled. There, all three brothers were shot to death. Their bodies were then loaded back into a car and dumped on a road in nearby Allegheny County. It was brutal, it was bold, and it was a fatal mistake. The Volpe brothers had been connected to the New York families, specifically to what would become the Genovese crime family. Bazzano had just murdered 3 men without getting permission from the commission, the ruling council of mafia bosses that had been established to prevent exactly this kind of freelance violence. A message was sent to Bazzano: "Come to New York to explain yourself." Bazzano must have known this was a death sentence, but he had no choice. If he refused to come, he would be hunted down. If he ran, his family would be targets. The rules of the Mafia were clear. When the commission calls, you answer. On August 8, 1932, just 10 days after the Volpe murders, John Bazzano traveled to New York. He met with representatives of several families. The meeting was cordial at first. Drinks were offered, then suddenly, Bazzano was grabbed. He was strangled with a rope and stabbed multiple times. His body was placed in a burlap sack and dumped in a creek in Brooklyn. The message was clear. Unauthorized violence would not be tolerated. John LaRocca, now in his early 30s and rising through the organization's ranks, absorbed the most important lesson of all. Violence attracts attention, and attention brings death. LaRocca had already begun practicing restraint, watching carefully as other ambitious men acted recklessly and paid with their lives. He remembered a minor dispute over a shipment of liquor where two young gangsters had argued loudly in front of witnesses, drawing unwanted attention from rival crews. Instead of intervening violently, John suggested a compromise. The shipment would be split, debts recalculated, and no guns drawn. The decision earned him respect quietly, without headlines or unnecessary bloodshed. While others gained reputations for fear, LaRocca began earning one for discretion, a subtle but powerful form of influence that would define his leadership. The bosses who had been killed, Monastero, Siragusa, Bazzano, had all been men of violence, men who believed that force was the answer to every problem. And they had all died violently within 3 years of taking power. LaRocca developed a philosophy that would guide him for the rest of his life. Make money, not headlines. Build power through relationships, not through fear. Earn loyalty, don't demand it. And above all, stay quiet. After John Bazzano's murder, the commission installed Vincenzo Capizzi as boss of the Pittsburgh family. Capizzi was an older man, less ambitious and less violent than his predecessors. He understood that the blood-soaked 1920s and early 1930s had brought unwanted attention to the organization. It was time to be smarter. Capizzi brought in Frank Amato as his underboss. Amato was a shrewd businessman who understood that the real money in organized crime wasn't in bootlegging, which would end when prohibition ended, but in more sustainable rackets, gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and especially coin-operated machines. This was John LaRocca's real education under Capizzi and Amato. LaRocca learned the coin-operated machine business. This might sound mundane, but in the 1930s and 1940s, it was a gold mine. Slot machines, pinball machines, jukeboxes, these were everywhere. They were in bars, restaurants, social clubs, corner stores, and someone had to own them, maintain them, collect the money from them. The coin-operated machine business was perfect for organized crime. It generated steady cash income. It provided a legitimate-seeming business front. It required a distribution network, and most importantly, it gave you a presence in thousands of establishments across a city. When you control the jukeboxes and slot machines in a bar, you have a relationship with the bar owner. And when you have relationships with hundreds of bar owners, you have power. LaRocca became an expert in the business. He learned how to place machines in new locations, how to maintain them, how to keep detailed records, 2 sets. Naturally, one for the government, one real one, how to collect money efficiently, and how to handle bar owners who thought they could cheat by underreporting the take. But he also learned the more subtle aspects of the business. He learned how to build relationships with the bar owners, how to make them feel that having his machines was a privilege, not an imposition. He learned how to identify which businesses were struggling and might need a loan at high interest. Of course, he learned how to network with bar owners, restaurant owners, and social club operators, building webs of connection that would prove invaluable later. Most importantly, he learned patience. While other young mobsters were impatient for advancement, eager to make their mark with some bold move, LaRocca was content to learn, to build his network, to make money steadily and quietly. One afternoon, a small bar owner hesitated to pay the weekly earnings from the jukeboxes, claiming mechanical errors. Most young mobsters might have threatened him or forcibly collected the money. John, however, calmly examined the machines, pointed out the discrepancies, and suggested a schedule to prevent future misunderstandings. By the end of the day, the owner was grateful for the guidance and paid in full. It was a small victory, unnoticed by the public, but it demonstrated LaRocca's philosophy. Influence was better earned than demanded, and loyalty was stronger when it was voluntary, quiet, methodical, patient. These were the weapons he wielded far more effectively than a gun. He watched as Prohibition ended in 1933, seeing how the men who had built their entire operations around bootlegging suddenly found themselves scrambling for new rackets. But the coin-operated machine business, the gambling operations, the loan sharking, these continued regardless of what was legal or illegal. The mob bosses who had diversified thrived. The ones who had put all their eggs in the bootlegging basket struggled. Lesson learned: diversify your income streams. Build sustainable operations. Think long-term. During the 1930s and 1940s, LaRocca also expanded into other areas. He became involved in gambling operations, numbers running, sports betting, dice games, card games. The working-class neighborhoods of Pittsburgh were full of men who liked to gamble, who would bet on anything: baseball games, boxing matches, numbers. The profit margins weren't as high as bootlegging had been, but the risks were lower and the business was sustainable. He became involved in labor racketeering. The 1930s saw an explosion of union organizing in America, especially in industrial cities like Pittsburgh. The steel mills, coal mines, and factories were unionizing. And wherever there were unions, there were opportunities for organized crime. Unions had treasuries that could be looted. They had pension funds that could be invested in mob-controlled businesses at high returns. They had the power to call strikes, which meant they had leverage over business owners. A mobster with influence in a union was a mobster with real power. LaRocca began building relationships with union officials, particularly in the Teamsters, which represented truck drivers, crucial in a business like bootlegging and later in the distribution of goods. A friendly union official could ensure that your businesses weren't hit by strikes. An unfriendly union official could be replaced, sometimes through violence, but more often through careful manipulation of union politics. Throughout all of this, LaRocca was building something more valuable than money: a reputation. He was known as reliable, smart, and most importantly, quiet. He didn't brag. He didn't show off. He didn't cause problems. When he was given a task, he completed it. When he was told to keep something confidential, it stayed confidential. When disputes arose, he settled them without violence whenever possible. In 1937, Vincenzo Capizzi died. Frank Amato became boss, and the organization barely noticed the transition. This itself was a sign of maturity. In the old days, a change of boss meant violence and chaos. Under Amato, it was a smooth handover of power. Amato recognized LaRocca's value and began elevating him through the ranks. LaRocca became a capo, a captain, with his own crew of soldiers and associates. He had earned it, not through violence or ambition, but through competence and loyalty. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, LaRocca was one of the most respected men in the Pittsburgh family. He was in his 40s now, no longer a young man but not yet old. He had survived longer than the violent bosses of the 1920s and early 1930s. He had built a legitimate business front with his coin-operated machine company. He had connections throughout Pittsburgh's underworld and into the straight world of business and politics. He had a wife and children. He had married and started a family, presenting to the world the image of a respectable Italian-American businessman. And he was waiting, because Frank Amato was getting old, and everyone in the organization knew what would come next. John LaRocca was going to become the boss. In 1956, at the age of 55, John Sebastian LaRocca officially became the boss of the Pittsburgh crime family. The transition was so smooth, So quiet that law enforcement didn't even realize it had happened at first. Frank Amato's health had been declining for several years. He was in his 70s, suffering from the various ailments that come with age. But rather than clinging to power until death, as some mob bosses did, Amato recognized reality. He could no longer run the day-to-day operations of the family. He needed to step back, but here's where LaRocca's intelligence showed itself. Rather than pushing Amato aside, rather than making the old boss feel humiliated or unnecessary, LaRocca insisted that Amato remain as consigliere and advisor. Amato would still receive his share of the profits. He would still be consulted on major decisions. He would still be shown respect. This was brilliant for several reasons. First, it meant that Amato's supporters within the family had no reason to oppose LaRocca's elevation. Their boss was being treated with honor, not being discarded. Second, it meant that LaRocca actually did have access to Amato's decades of experience and wisdom. And third, it set a precedent for how the Pittsburgh family would handle transitions of power. Peacefully, respectfully, with continuity. Compare this to what was happening in other families in New York. Bosses were being assassinated by ambitious underlings. In Chicago, the outfit was engaged in bloody internal warfare. But in Pittsburgh, the transition from Amato to LaRocca was so quiet that the FBI didn't even update their organizational charts for months. LaRocca's philosophy as boss was simple: make money, not headlines. He looked at what had destroyed the bosses of the 1920s and 1930s: violence, flashiness, ego, stupidity, and he did the opposite. He enforced a strict code on his men. No unnecessary violence, no publicity-seeking behavior. No cooperation with law enforcement under any circumstances, absolute loyalty to the family. Soldiers in the LaRocca family didn't drive Cadillacs or wear expensive jewelry. They didn't hang out in flashy nightclubs or date movie starlets. They lived in modest homes in Italian-American neighborhoods. They went to church on Sundays. They sent their kids to Catholic schools, to their neighbors. They appeared to be nothing more than small businessmen guys who owned a few vending machines. Maybe a bar, maybe a small trucking company. This was exactly what LaRocca wanted. The less visible the family was, the safer it was. But invisibility didn't mean weakness under LaRocca. The Pittsburgh family expanded its operations throughout western Pennsylvania and into neighboring Ohio and West Virginia. The coin-operated machine business continued to be a major source of income. Gambling operations flourished, numbers running. Sports betting, dice games, card games, loan sharking became a major profit center, with money being lent out at extortionate interest rates to gamblers, small business owners, and anyone else who needed cash and couldn't get it from legitimate sources. Most importantly, LaRocca expanded the family's control over labor unions. This was the key to real power. A mobster with union connections could do more than just steal from union treasuries. Though that was certainly profitable, he could control labor disputes, ensuring that businesses friendly to the mob never faced strikes, while businesses that refused to cooperate suddenly found themselves with labor problems. He could secure no-show jobs for soldiers, giving them legitimate employment histories and income they could report to the IRS. He could influence elections, both union elections and political elections. By delivering blocks of union votes, LaRocca cultivated relationships with officials in Teamsters Local 1058, representing truck drivers in the Pittsburgh area through the Teamsters. The Pittsburgh family had influence over the transportation of goods throughout the region. A truck driver's strike could paralyze the steel mills, the coal mines, the factories. That kind of power was worth far more than the take from a dozen gambling operations. He also built relationships with construction unions. Pittsburgh in the 1950s was undergoing urban renewal projects, building new highways, renovating downtown. Every construction project needed labor, and labor meant unions. A mob-controlled union could ensure that only certain contractors got jobs. that those contractors paid consulting fees to the right people, that materials were purchased from mob-connected suppliers at inflated prices. The potential for profit was enormous. But LaRocca's most important work as a new boss was building and maintaining relationships with other crime families. He understood something that many mob bosses didn't. In organized crime, your network is your net worth. November 14, 1957. This date would become one of the most famous in American Mafia history. And John LaRocca would be right in the middle of it. The meeting was called by Vito Genovese, the powerful boss of one of New York's 5 families. The official purpose was twofold. First, to recognize Genovese's claim to leadership after the attempted assassination of Frank Costello and the murder of Albert Anastasia. Second, to discuss the future of the American Mafia, particularly the question of whether the family should get involved in drug trafficking. The meeting was to be held at the rural estate of Joseph Barbara, a mobster from the Bufalino crime family in Appalachian, New York. Barbara's estate was perfect for such a gathering, isolated, spacious, with a large house that could accommodate dozens of men. The plan was for more than 100 mob bosses and high-ranking members from crime families across the country to gather, discuss business, eat a big meal, and return home. It was supposed to be routine. LaRocca attended with 2 of his top men, Gabriel Kelly Manorino, who was his underboss and closest confidant, and Michael James Genovese, a rising captain in the family. The 3 men drove from Pittsburgh to Appalachian, probably expecting a boring but necessary day of mob politics. What happened instead would change the American Mafia forever. The mobsters began arriving on November 13th and 14th. More than 100 men, representing crime families from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, California, and beyond. It was the largest gathering of American Mafia figures ever assembled in one place. And their cars gave them away. The mobsters drove expensive vehicles, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chrysler Imperials. They had out-of-state license plates. They dressed in expensive suits in rural upstate New York in 1957. A parade of luxury cars with out-of-state plates wasn't exactly subtle. A New York State trooper named Edgar Croswell had been keeping an eye on Joseph Barbara for years, suspecting he was involved in organized crime. When he saw the expensive cars arriving at Barbara's estate, Croswell called for backup. By the afternoon of November 14th, state police had set up a roadblock on the road leading to the estate. Inside the Barbara home, the meeting was in progress. The bosses were eating, drinking, arguing about policy. And then someone looked out a window and saw police cars. Panic erupted. More than 100 mob bosses suddenly realized they were about to be caught in the largest police raid on a mafia gathering in history. Some men tried to leave by the front driveway and were stopped at the police roadblock. Others scattered into the woods surrounding the estate, abandoning their expensive cars and running through the trees like criminals fleeing a bank robbery. It would have been comical if it hadn't been so serious. Some of the most powerful men in American organized crime, men who controlled criminal empires worth millions of dollars, were running through the woods in their expensive suits, getting caught on barbed wire fences, hiding behind trees, desperately trying to avoid arrest. About 60 men were detained by the police. Many others managed to escape into the woods and eventually made their way back to their vehicles or found other ways to leave the area. LaRocca, demonstrating the survival instincts that would serve him well throughout his career, managed to avoid arrest. Whether he escaped into the woods, had already left before the raid, or simply wasn't detained by the police is unclear from the historical record. What is clear is that while many of his fellow bosses were being questioned and photographed by the police, LaRocca got away clean. The aftermath of Appalachian was devastating for the American Mafia. The men who were detained were questioned extensively. While most invoked their Fifth Amendment rights and refused to answer questions, the simple fact that they were there That more than 60 known criminals had gathered at the same location at the same time was proof that organized crime was a national phenomenon, not just a local problem. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly denied that the Mafia existed. He claimed that organized crime was just a collection of local gangs. Nothing more. Appalachian proved he was wrong. The newspapers ran photos of the men who were detained. The names read like a who's who of American organized crime: Vito Genovese, Carlo Gambino, Joseph Profaci, Joseph Bonanno, Russell Bufalino, and dozens of others. The FBI was forced to acknowledge what everyone in the underworld had always known. The Mafia was real. It was organized and it operated nationally. Hoover created the Top Hoodlum program, ordering FBI field offices across the country to identify and investigate the top organized crime figures in their areas. For LaRocca, who had built his entire approach to organized crime around staying invisible, Appalachian was a nightmare. Suddenly, even though he hadn't been arrested, his name was being connected to organized crime at the national level. The FBI in Pittsburgh, which had largely ignored the relatively quiet Pittsburgh family, now had orders to investigate. LaRocca would have to be more careful than ever. The Appalachian meeting had consequences that rippled through the years that followed. In 1959, LaRocca was called to testify before the Senate Rackets Committee, chaired by Senator John McClellan and with Robert F. Kennedy serving as chief counsel. The McClellan Committee, as it was known, was investigating labor racketeering and organized crime. They had extensive files on the men who had been at Appalachian and wanted to know what had been discussed at the meeting. LaRocca appeared before the committee, sworn in, and proceeded to invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination to every substantive question asked. Mr. LaRocca, were you present at the residence of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York on November 14, 1957? I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that my answer might tend to incriminate me. Mr. LaRocca, are you a member of organized crime? I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that my answer might tend to incriminate me. Mr. LaRocca, what is the nature of your business? I respectfully decline to answer on the grounds that my answer might tend to incriminate me. Robert Kennedy, frustrated by LaRocca's stonewalling, tried various approaches: aggressive questioning, attempts to catch him in inconsistencies, suggestions that refusing to answer was itself an admission of guilt. None of it worked. LaRocca, who had learned the value of silence in prison 35 years earlier, gave the committee nothing. The Fifth Amendment strategy was legally sound. The committee couldn't compel him to testify against himself, but it had public relations consequences to anyone watching. LaRocca's refusal to answer even basic questions made him look guilty. The newspapers reported on his testimony, usually with headlines like "Pittsburgh Mobster Refuses to Cooperate" or "Crime Boss Takes the Fifth." For a man who valued invisibility, this was deeply problematic, but a bigger problem emerged: deportation proceedings. LaRocca had been born in Sicily and had immigrated to America as a child. He had never become a naturalized citizen, and under federal law, non-citizens with criminal records, especially felony convictions for crimes of moral turpitude, could be deported. LaRocca's 1922 assault conviction, which had seemed like ancient history, suddenly became a threat to his entire existence. If the federal government could deport him back to Italy, his American criminal empire would be lost. The deportation proceedings dragged on for years. LaRocca hired lawyers, the best lawyers money could buy, and they fought on every possible ground. They argued that the conviction was too old to count. They argued that LaRocca had rehabilitated himself. They argued that deportation would separate him from his American-born family, constituting cruel and unusual punishment. They filed motion after motion, appeal after appeal, dragging the process out as long as possible. Meanwhile, LaRocca was reaching out to every political connection he had. One of the advantages of being a mob boss with union connections was that you had relationships with politicians. Politicians needed union support to get elected, and unions under mob influence could deliver that support or withhold it. The breakthrough came through an unlikely source, Pennsylvania Governor John Fine, who had left office in 1955 but still had influence. In a move that reeked of political corruption, Governor Fine granted LaRocca a pardon for his 1922 assault conviction. The pardon was backdated, making it appear as though LaRocca had received clemency years earlier, with the pardon in hand. LaRocca's lawyers argued that he no longer had a deportable offense on his record. The federal government fought this argument, but ultimately the pardon held up. The deportation proceedings were dropped. LaRocca had survived, but he had learned another crucial lesson: stay out of the spotlight. Every time his name appeared in the newspapers, every time he had to appear before a government committee, every time the federal government took an interest in him, his entire existence was at risk. From that point forward, LaRocca became even more obsessive about secrecy and low profile. He gave strict orders to his men: no unnecessary violence, no publicity, no actions that would draw law enforcement attention. If you had a problem with someone, you solved it quietly. If you made money, you kept it quiet. If law enforcement questioned you, you took the Fifth Amendment and called a lawyer. This philosophy would define the Pittsburgh family for the next 25 years. Before we continue with LaRocca's story in Pittsburgh, we need to detour to Cuba, because the island nation 90 miles from Florida was crucial to understanding the power and reach of the American Mafia in the 1950s. Cuba, under President Fulgencio Batista, was a paradise for organized crime. Batista, who had come to power through a military coup in 1952, was deeply corrupt and willing to work with anyone who could help him maintain power and make money. The American Mafia, flush with cash from their domestic operations, saw Cuba as an opportunity too good to pass up. Havana in the 1950s was extraordinary. The city glittered with casinos, nightclubs, hotels, and restaurants catering to wealthy American tourists. The Sans Souci, the Tropicana, the Hotel Riviera, the Hotel Nacional, these weren't just entertainment venues. They were mob-owned money machines. Gambling was legal in Cuba, which meant the profits could be enormous without the risk of police raids that plagued gambling operations in the United States. Santo Traficante Jr., boss of the Tampa crime family, was the main American Mafia figure in Cuba. His family had connections to Cuba going back decades, and he served as the primary liaison between the Cuban government and the various American crime families that wanted a piece of the action. John LaRocca, through his connections to other crime families, and particularly through his underboss, Gabriel Kelly Manorino, secured a share in the Sans Souci Hotel and Casino in Havana. The Sans Souci was one of the premier establishments in Havana. It featured a casino, a nightclub with world-class entertainment, a restaurant and gardens. Stars like Marlene Dietrich, Tony Bennett, and Nat King Cole performed there. The air in Havana buzzed with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Mobsters in sharp suits rubbed elbows with tourists in glamorous attire, while the faint tension of underworld dealings simmered beneath the glittering lights. It was a city of contrasts, luxury and danger, pleasure and politics, all rolled into one intoxicating spectacle. Wealthy Americans, businessmen, celebrities, and yes, some criminals would fly to Havana for weekends of gambling, drinking, and entertainment that would be illegal back in the States. For the Pittsburgh family, the Cuban operation was incredibly profitable. The casinos generated enormous cash flows. The money could be laundered through various schemes before being brought back to the United States. And the Cuban operations provided excellent opportunities for networking with other crime families. Nothing builds relationships quite like sharing in a profitable enterprise. LaRocca and Manorino also provided expertise and equipment. Pittsburgh's coin-operated machine business meant they had access to slot machines, knowledge of how to maintain them, and understanding of how to maximize their profitability. These slot machines were shipped to Cuba and installed in the Sans Souci and other establishments. The Cuban Golden Age lasted through most of the 1950s. LaRocca and his associates would periodically travel to Havana, ostensibly as tourists, but actually to check on their investments and meet with other mobsters. The FBI, monitoring the travels of known organized crime figures, noted these trips but couldn't do much about them. Traveling to Cuba wasn't illegal, and the gambling operations were legal under Cuban law. Then came January 1st, 1959. Fidel Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana, and President Batista fled the country. Within days, Castro's government began nationalizing the casinos. The American mobsters were given a simple choice: leave Cuba or face arrest. Santo Trafficante Jr. was actually arrested and held for several weeks before being released and expelled from the country. Other mobsters got out faster. The Sans Souci, along with all the other mob-owned casinos, was seized by the Cuban government overnight. Millions of dollars in mob investments disappeared. For LaRocca, the Cuban Revolution was a financial blow, but not a disaster. Unlike some mobsters who had invested everything in Cuba, LaRocca had maintained diverse operations. The Pittsburgh family's core businesses: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and coin-operated machines in western Pennsylvania, continued generating income regardless of what happened in Cuba. But the lesson was clear: political instability could destroy even the most profitable operation. LaRocca became even more cautious about overextending the family's operations or becoming dependent on any single source of income. The Cuban experience also reinforced his belief in the importance of relationships. While his money was gone, his relationship with Santo Trafficante Jr. remained strong. Years later, this relationship would prove valuable in other contexts. John LaRocca understood something that many mob bosses didn't. In organized crime, isolation is death. The bosses who tried to operate independently, who thought they could build an empire without alliances, inevitably faced problems they couldn't handle alone. The commission might sanction them for violations of protocol. A neighboring family might encroach on their territory. Law enforcement might target them without other families providing political cover. But a mob boss with strong alliances across multiple families was much safer. If the commission moved against him, his allies would object. If a neighboring family got aggressive, his allies would support him. If law enforcement targeted him, his allies could use their political connections to provide interference. LaRocca spent the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s building a network of alliances that would protect the Pittsburgh family and enhance its power. His most important alliance was with Carlo Gambino, boss of what would become the most powerful crime family in New York. Gambino and LaRocca were similar in many ways. Both were Sicilian immigrants. Both valued intelligence over violence. Both understood the importance of keeping a low profile. The two men developed a relationship of mutual respect and cooperation. Through Gambino, LaRocca had access to the enormous resources of the New York families. On one occasion, LaRocca met Gambino in a quiet Brooklyn restaurant, sharing cigars and small talk while discussing the discreet transfer of cash and influence. No fanfare, no violence, just strategy and mutual respect. It was in these unremarkable moments that true power quietly shifted across the country. If the Pittsburgh family needed help with a problem, Gambino could provide it. If they needed to move money, Gambino's connections made it possible. If they needed to reach out to families in other parts of the country, Gambino could facilitate the introduction. In return, LaRocca provided Gambino with a loyal ally in a strategic location. Pittsburgh sat at the crossroads of major transportation routes between the East Coast and the Midwest. Control over Pittsburgh meant influence over the movement of goods, both legal and illegal, through a crucial region. LaRocca could provide support for Gambino's operations when needed. LaRocca also built a strong relationship with Angelo Bruno, boss of the Philadelphia crime family. Bruno, known as the docile Don for his preference for diplomacy over violence, was another old-school boss who shared LaRocca's values. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh were close enough geographically that the two families needed to maintain good relations to avoid territorial disputes. LaRocca and Bruno ensured that the border between their territories was clearly defined and respected by both sides. Another crucial alliance was with Russell Bufalino, boss of the crime family based in northeastern Pennsylvania. The Bufalino family, though relatively small, punched above its weight due to Russell's intelligence and connections. Bufalino and LaRocca had known each other for years. Both had been at the Appalachian meeting and maintained a cooperative relationship. The Bufalino family's territory in northeastern Pennsylvania bordered the Pittsburgh family's territory, so cooperation was essential to avoid conflicts. LaRocca also maintained good relations with Nick Savella, boss of the Kansas City crime family. This connection was important for Midwest gambling operations and labor union activities that stretched across state lines. These relationships weren't just social niceties. They were carefully cultivated business relationships backed by concrete exchanges of value. LaRocca would provide favors, support for a position at a commission meeting, assistance with a difficult problem, cooperation on a joint venture. In return, he received favors, support when he needed it, access to resources, protection from threats. The network LaRocca built was his greatest achievement as a mob boss. It meant that the Pittsburgh family, though relatively small compared to the New York families, was deeply connected to the most powerful criminal organizations in America. An attack on the Pittsburgh family would be an attack on its allies. A move against LaRocca would require the approval of some of the most powerful bosses in the country. This network would prove crucial in the years to come. As law enforcement pressure increased and the American Mafia faced unprecedented challenges. If gambling and loan sharking were the Pittsburgh family's bread and butter, labor union control was the meat. This was where the real sustainable power lay. By the 1960s, LaRocca had developed extensive influence over several unions operating in the Pittsburgh area. The most important was Teamsters Local 1058, representing truck drivers in the region. The Teamsters Union nationally had a long and well-documented history of mob influence. Jimmy Hoffa, the union's president from 1957 to 1971, had extensive ties to organized crime. Hoffa understood that mob-controlled locals could deliver political support when needed, and in return, mob bosses would ensure labor peace in their territories. LaRocca's influence in Local 1058 gave the Pittsburgh family several advantages. First, no-show jobs. These were union positions that existed on paper, but required no actual work. A mob soldier could be officially employed as a truck driver or warehouse worker, receiving a regular paycheck that provided legitimate income for tax purposes, while actually spending his time on criminal activities. This solved one of organized crime's persistent problems: how to explain to the IRS where your money came from. Second, labor peace for the right price. A business that wanted to avoid strikes could reach out to the right people and make the right payments, and suddenly their employees would be happy and productive. A business that didn't cooperate might find that their workers were very dissatisfied and very willing to strike at inconvenient times. Third, control over the movement of goods. Truck drivers controlled transportation. In a city like Pittsburgh, dependent on steel mills, coal mines, and manufacturing, control over transportation meant control over the economy. A strike by truck drivers could bring the city to its knees within days. Once, a potential strike loomed over a major steel shipment. A single phone call from LaRocca to the union steward, coupled with a discreet gesture of incentive, kept the trucks rolling and the steel moving, demonstrating how power in Pittsburgh rarely needed a gun to be enforced. This kind of power was worth far more than any gambling operation. Fourth, political influence. Unions endorsed candidates, provided volunteers for campaigns, and most importantly, delivered votes. In working-class neighborhoods, union endorsements mattered. A mob boss with union connections could deliver support to friendly politicians and withhold it from hostile ones. LaRocca also had influence in construction unions. Pittsburgh in the 1960s was undergoing significant urban renewal. The city was building new highways, renovating downtown, constructing new buildings. Every one of these projects required union labor, and the unions decided which contractors got the workers they needed. The system worked like this. A construction company wanted to bid on a major project. To execute the project, they needed skilled union labor: electricians, plumbers, carpenters, heavy equipment operators. If the construction company had the right connections, meaning they had relationships with the mob-controlled unions, they could be assured of getting the workers they needed on schedule, without labor problems. If they didn't have the right connections, they might find that workers were unavailable, that there were mysterious delays, that productivity was surprisingly low. The mob-connected construction companies naturally charged higher prices for their bids. After all, they had expenses that legitimate companies didn't have, namely the payments to the mob. But because they could guarantee completion without labor problems, they often won the bids anyway. And where did some of the money go? To the politicians who awarded the contracts. Of course, the circle of corruption was complete. The mob controlled the unions controlled the workers. The workers built the projects. The mob-connected contractors overcharged for the projects. And the politicians who approved the overpriced contracts received payoffs. LaRocca didn't personally handle all of this. He had soldiers and associates who managed the day-to-day relationships with union officials, contractors, and politicians, but he was the ultimate authority. The man who made the big decisions, the person who decided which politicians to support and which to oppose. The beauty of this system was its sustainability. Gambling operations could be raided, loan sharking could be prosecuted, but labor union influence was much harder to eliminate. The relationships were complex and often deniable. The money moved through multiple layers of transactions, and the politicians who benefited from the system had every incentive to protect it. This was the foundation of LaRocca's power. Not violence, not even money really, but relationships and influence that extended throughout the legitimate economy and political system. While LaRocca was consolidating power in Pittsburgh, he was also quietly expanding the family's operations into neighboring Ohio. Youngstown, Ohio, about 60 miles northwest of Pittsburgh, was a natural target for expansion. The city was similar to Pittsburgh, a steel town, working class, heavily unionized, with a large Italian-American population. It was also known as one of the most corrupt cities in America, where organized crime and politics were so intertwined that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The Cleveland crime family, under boss John Scalish, had influence in Youngstown, but Cleveland was far from Youngstown, and Scalish wasn't particularly interested in the day-to-day operations there. This created an opportunity for LaRocca, rather than challenging Cleveland directly, which would have violated Mafia protocol and potentially started a war. LaRocca reached out to Scalish and proposed a partnership. Their first Youngstown operation was modest, a handful of numbers games in quiet neighborhood bars, but it worked flawlessly. No disputes, no attention, just cash flowing in. Lesson learned: LaRocca's approach was methodical. Expand steadily, profit quietly, and avoid unnecessary enemies. The Pittsburgh family would handle operations in Youngstown, and Cleveland would receive a share of the profits. This was win-win. Cleveland got money without having to do the work, and Pittsburgh got access to a lucrative territory. Youngstown's gambling operations became a major profit center for the Pittsburgh family. Numbers running, sports betting, dice games, card games. All of these flourished in the working-class neighborhoods where the police were either corrupt or indifferent. Youngstown's location on major transportation routes also made it valuable for other activities. The Pittsburgh family also expanded into other Rust Belt cities in eastern Ohio and the West Virginia Panhandle. These areas were economically similar to Pittsburgh industrial, working class, declining, and offered opportunities for the same rackets that worked in Pittsburgh: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering. LaRocca was careful not to overextend. He didn't try to take over Cleveland or challenge other established families. He focused on areas where there was opportunity without conflict. He maintained good relationships with neighboring bosses, ensuring that territorial boundaries were clear and respected. This careful, methodical expansion was typical of LaRocca's approach. While other bosses dreamed of building huge empires, LaRocca was content to steadily grow his organization's reach and profitability. He understood that sustainable growth was better than dramatic expansion followed by violent conflict or law enforcement crackdown. By the end of the 1960s, the Pittsburgh crime family under LaRocca controlled operations throughout western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and the West Virginia Panhandle. It wasn't the largest crime family in America. The New York families were far bigger, but it was one of the most stable and profitable. And John LaRocca, now in his late 60s, had accomplished something remarkable. He had been boss for over a decade without a single major prosecution, without a significant internal conflict, without attracting serious law enforcement attention in the world of organized crime. This was almost unheard of by the 1970s. John LaRocca had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight. His home was in Pittsburgh's North Side, a working-class Italian-American neighborhood. The house was nice but not ostentatious, a modest two-story home that wouldn't look out of place on any middle-class street in America. There was no gate, no guards, no obvious security to anyone walking by. It looked like the home of a retired businessman. Nothing more. LaRocca drove ordinary cars. No Cadillacs, no Lincolns, nothing that would attract attention. His clothing was conservative. Suits, yes, but off-the-rack suits from local stores, not custom-tailored Italian imports. He wore a simple watch, no flashy jewelry. To see him on the street, you would never guess he controlled a criminal organization worth millions of dollars. One afternoon, LaRocca helped a neighbor carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs, smiling and exchanging small talk. To onlookers, he was simply a kind elderly man in the neighborhood, a facade that concealed decades of calculated criminal empire building. Every Sunday, LaRocca attended Mass at Our Lady of Grace Catholic Church. He sat with his family, participated in the service, and contributed to the collection plate. He was known in the parish as a generous supporter of the church. Donations for this cause, contributions for that project. The priests who knew him thought he was a successful businessman who valued his faith and community. This was exactly what LaRocca wanted them to think. His daily routine was deliberately boring. He would leave his house in the morning, sometimes going to a legitimate business office. His coin-operated machine company had a real office, real employees, real tax returns. He would have lunch at local Italian restaurants, but nothing flashy family-owned places in the neighborhood where he could sit at a table in the back and talk quietly with associates. He would return home for dinner with his family. No nightclubs, no casinos, no late-night meetings in parking lots. When LaRocca needed to conduct actual mob business, he was extremely careful. Meetings were held in private homes, often the homes of trusted associates. Phones were not used for sensitive conversations. LaRocca assumed correctly that the FBI had the capability to wiretap phone lines. Important messages were delivered in person. Financial records were kept to a minimum. And what records did exist were carefully coded. LaRocca's approach to secrecy extended to his soldiers. He enforced strict rules about behavior and appearance. Pittsburgh family members didn't hang out in known mob social clubs where FBI agents could photograph everyone coming and going. They didn't associate with known criminals from other cities. They didn't dress flashily or drive expensive cars. They blended into their neighborhoods, appearing to be ordinary working-class Italian Americans. This wasn't just paranoia, it was smart business. By the 1970s, the FBI had significantly improved its ability to investigate organized crime. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants, these were now standard tools in the fight against the Mafia. The families that maintained high profiles, where bosses held court in public places and soldiers strutted around like peacocks, were being devastated by prosecutions. But the FBI's file on John LaRocca, while extensive, contained more suspicions than evidence. They knew he was the boss. They knew he controlled gambling operations, loan sharking, and had influence over labor unions. But they couldn't prove it in a way that would stand up in court. Part of the problem was that LaRocca rarely gave direct orders. He would express his wishes, his concerns, his thoughts about how a situation should be handled, and then his subordinates, understanding what was expected, would handle it. There was no recording of LaRocca saying, "Go break that guy's legs," or "Skim 10% from the Union Treasury." There were just conversations between trusted associates, carefully phrased to avoid incrimination. LaRocca's family life also provided cover. He was married to his wife for decades, a stable, traditional Italian-American marriage. They had children who went to good schools, who grew up to have legitimate careers. At family gatherings, weddings, funerals, LaRocca was the patriarch, the grandfather who gave advice, who told stories, who held the family together. His neighbors genuinely liked him. He was quiet, respectful, never caused problems. If someone in the neighborhood needed help, LaRocca was known to provide assistance, a loan when times were tough, a recommendation for a job, help navigating some bureaucratic problem. He was exactly the kind of neighbor people wanted, present but not intrusive, helpful but not overbearing. This was LaRocca's greatest achievement. He had built a criminal empire while maintaining the appearance of being nothing more than a successful, respectable member of his community. The FBI might suspect what he really was, but his neighbors, his fellow parishioners, even many of his business associates, saw only what he wanted them to see. By the mid-1970s, the Pittsburgh crime family's operations had matured into a well-oiled machine. The organization generated steady income from multiple sources, each carefully structured to minimize legal risk. The gambling operations remained a core business, numbers running. The illegal lottery that was popular in working-class neighborhoods generated enormous cash flow every day. People throughout Pittsburgh and surrounding areas would place small bets, hoping their number would hit. The odds were terrible for the bettors, but fantastic for the operators. The Pittsburgh family controlled most of the numbers operations in their territory, taking in hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Sports betting was equally profitable. Every football season, every baseball season, every major sporting event, people wanted to bet. The Pittsburgh family provided the service through a network of bookmakers operating in bars, social clubs, and other locations. The bookmakers took the bets, passed the money up the chain, and paid out winnings when necessary. The family's cut was substantial. Loan sharking, lending money at extremely high interest rates, was another major profit center. Often the family collected debts not through violence but persuasion, a stern warning, a reminder of obligations, and the subtle implication that failure had consequences. It was a business of control, with intimidation delivered in whispers rather than gunshots. The customers were primarily gamblers who had lost more than they could afford, and small business owners who couldn't get legitimate bank loans. The interest rates were usurious, often 2 to 3% per week, which translated to over 100% annually. Miss a payment and the interest would compound. Fall too far behind and enforcers would pay a visit. The loan sharking operation served another purpose. It gave the family leverage. A business owner who owed the family money might be pressured to provide other services. A location for gambling operations. A no-show job for a soldier. Cooperation in some other scheme. Debt was a form of control. The coin-operated machine business continued to provide both legitimate income and opportunities for criminal activity. The legitimate side vending machines, jukeboxes, and other legal devices generated real profits and provided a cover story for LaRocca and his associates' wealth. The illegal side slot machines in locations where gambling was prohibited added additional profit. Labor union influence remained crucial through relationships with union officials. The Pittsburgh family could secure favorable contracts, no-show jobs, and influence over labor disputes. They had influence in the Teamsters, construction unions, and several other labor organizations. This influence translated into both direct income through embezzlement, kickbacks, and other schemes, and indirect power through the ability to cause or prevent labor problems for businesses. Protection rackets, though less emphasized than in earlier eras, still operated in some neighborhoods. Businesses in Little Italy and other Italian-American areas paid protection money to ensure they wouldn't have problems. The protection was often from the mob itself. Pay and we won't bother you. Don't pay and unfortunate things might happen to your business. All of these operations were carefully compartmentalized. A soldier running a bookmaking operation didn't necessarily know about the loan sharking operation. An associate managing coin-operated machines didn't know about the union rackets. This compartmentalization served two purposes. It limited what any individual could reveal to law enforcement if arrested, and it prevented any single person from accumulating enough knowledge to challenge LaRocca's authority. The money flowed up through the organization. Street-level operators kicked up to their immediate supervisors. Soldiers kicked up to their capos. Capos kicked up to LaRocca's underboss and ultimately to LaRocca himself. At each level, people took their cut, but the biggest share always went to the boss. LaRocca had also developed sophisticated money laundering schemes. Cash from illegal operations couldn't simply be deposited in banks without attracting IRS attention. Instead, it was laundered through legitimate businesses, overstating the income of the coin-operated machine business, running it through cash-intensive businesses like restaurants and bars, using it to purchase real estate through shell companies. The Pittsburgh family's financial structure was complex enough that unraveling it would require extensive investigation and forensic accounting. As long as LaRocca and his associates filed tax returns and paid at least some taxes, the IRS had little reason to dig deeper. The 1970s was a difficult decade for the American Mafia. The FBI's improved investigative techniques were paying off. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, gave prosecutors a powerful new tool to target organized crime. Major prosecutions were hitting families across the country. But the Pittsburgh family, under LaRocca's leadership, largely avoided the carnage. There were no major prosecutions of high-ranking Pittsburgh family members during the 1970s. Individual soldiers occasionally got arrested for bookmaking, loan sharking, or other crimes. But these were low-level arrests that didn't threaten the organization's structure. LaRocca himself was never charged with any crime during this period. Compare this to what was happening in other families in New York. The FBI was successfully using wiretaps and informants to build RICO cases against multiple families. Major bosses and underbosses were being indicted and convicted in New England. The FBI had managed to bug the headquarters of the Patriarca crime family, recording incriminating conversations that would lead to numerous convictions in Chicago. The outfit was being hit with major prosecutions related to their control of Las Vegas casinos. But in Pittsburgh, the FBI was frustrated. They knew the Pittsburgh family existed. They knew LaRocca was the boss. They had surveillance photos, informant reports, wiretap evidence of peripheral conversations. But they couldn't build the kind of comprehensive case that would take down the organization's leadership. Part of the reason was LaRocca's discipline. He simply didn't talk about criminal activities in ways that could be intercepted and used against him. He didn't hold meetings in locations where bugs could be planted. He didn't trust easily, so informants had difficulty penetrating the inner circle. But another reason was that the Pittsburgh family was simply less visible than other families. Meetings were conducted in dimly lit back rooms or over quiet dinners. Cash and instructions exchanged under the table. The less anyone noticed, the safer everyone was. A simple rule that kept the FBI frustrated for decades. They didn't operate major casinos that attracted federal attention. They didn't engage in high-profile murders that made headlines. They didn't have flamboyant bosses who loved media attention. They were boring from a law enforcement perspective, clearly engaged in criminal activity, but difficult to investigate and even more difficult to prosecute. LaRocca's soldiers followed the same pattern when arrested. They invoked their Fifth Amendment rights and called their lawyers. They didn't try to cut deals by informing on their colleagues. The family had a reputation for taking care of members who went to prison, supporting their families, providing lawyers, ensuring they had money in their commissary accounts. This loyalty was reciprocated the few times that potential informants appeared. They were identified and handled. Sometimes this meant bringing them back into the fold with a combination of threats and rewards. Sometimes it meant removing them from positions where they could do damage. And occasionally, very occasionally, it meant more permanent solutions. But violence was always LaRocca's last resort. He understood that murders attracted attention, that they could trigger investigations, that they could create blood feuds that lasted decades. If a problem could be solved with money, diplomacy, or intimidation, those were always preferred over killing. This measured approach to violence was another reason the Pittsburgh family stayed off law enforcement's radar. While other families were leaving bodies in car trunks and generating sensational headlines, Pittsburgh was quiet. By the late 1970s, John LaRocca was in his late 70s. He had been boss for over 20 years, longer than any of his predecessors. But age was catching up with him. His health was declining. The specific ailments aren't well documented, but the general pattern was clear. He was old, he was tired, and he could no longer handle the day-to-day demands of running a criminal organization. Gabriel Kelly Manarino, LaRocca's underboss and closest confidant for decades, took on more of the daily operations. Manarino had been with LaRocca since the early days, had stood beside him at Appalachian, had helped manage the Cuban operations, had been his right hand in building the Pittsburgh family into a stable, profitable enterprise. Manarino understood LaRocca's philosophy and implemented it faithfully. The organization continued operating smoothly, money continued flowing. Law enforcement continued to be frustrated by their inability to build solid cases. But in 1980, Manarino was diagnosed with cancer. Despite treatment, his health rapidly deteriorated. On December 11, 1980, Gabriel Kelly Manarino died at age 71. For LaRocca, this was devastating. Manarino wasn't just his underboss, he was his friend, his partner, the person he trusted more than anyone else in the organization. They had built the modern Pittsburgh family together, and now Manarino was gone. LaRocca promoted Michael James Genovese to acting boss. Genovese had been a high-ranking member of the family for years. had been at Appalachian with LaRocca and Manorino back in 1957 and understood how the organization operated. He was in his 60s himself, old enough to remember the lessons of the violent 1920s and 1930s, young enough to still handle the demands of leadership. But everyone understood that LaRocca remained the true boss. Major decisions still required his approval. Genovese was running the day-to-day operations, but LaRocca's wisdom and authority still guided the family. LaRocca's final years were spent largely at home with his family. He still received visitors, high-ranking members of the Pittsburgh family, representatives from other families, old friends and associates, but these meetings were infrequent and carefully arranged. He spent time with his grandchildren, watching them grow up, hoping they would avoid the life he had lived in the quiet of his home. LaRocca often reflected on the choices he had made, the empire he built, the friends he lost, and the legacy he would leave. Perhaps he thought true success wasn't the money or power, but the knowledge that his family would survive him. Untouched by the world he had navigated so carefully, he attended Mass regularly, perhaps contemplating mortality and wondering what awaited him in the next life. He maintained his relationships with the few old-timers who remained from his generation, men who remembered when bootlegging was the big opportunity, when Al Capone was in the headlines, when being in the mob meant something different than it did in the 1980s. The FBI continued monitoring him, but with less intensity. He was clearly in failing health. The real action in the Pittsburgh family was now centered around Michael Genovese and the other younger members. LaRocca was the retired Godfather, still respected, still consulted, but no longer in direct control in many ways. This was exactly what LaRocca had wanted his entire career: to step back from the spotlight, to let others handle the risks, to enjoy the fruits of decades of careful planning and disciplined execution. December 3, 1984. John Sebastian LaRocca died in his home in Pittsburgh's North Side. He was 82 years old. He died peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by family. The room was quiet, almost reverent, bathed in the soft golden glow of a bedside lamp. Shadows flickered across the walls, cast by the flickering candlelight of the small shrine his family had set up. Each photograph and memento a silent testament to a life that had shaped a city from the shadows. Outside, the streets of Pittsburgh went on as they always had. Cars passed, footsteps echoed. Life moved forward, but inside, time seemed to pause, honoring the final moments of a man who had spent decades orchestrating empires in the silence between words. In that stillness, every breath, every heartbeat, carried the weight of a life lived meticulously, strategically, and ultimately without the chaos that had undone so many others like him. His wife was there, his children were there, his grandchildren were there. A priest had administered last rites. It was the kind of death that most people hoped for: peaceful, painless, at home, with loved ones near, for a mob boss who had ruled for nearly 3 decades. This was almost miraculous in a world where bullets, betrayal, and prison cells claimed the lives of those who dared to climb too fast. The simplicity of this ending was nothing short of extraordinary. LaRocca had mastered the art of survival, not through violence or fear, but through patience, discretion, and an almost obsessive attention to the smallest details. The calm in the room, the quiet presence of loved ones, the absence of threats or interruptions. It was as though the universe itself had acknowledged his decades of skillful navigation and granted him the rarest of rewards: a life that ended exactly as it had been lived. Deliberately, quietly, and in control. Consider the statistics. Most mob bosses don't die of natural causes. They die in prison, like Vito Genovese. They're murdered by rivals, like Albert Anastasia and Paul Castellano. They die on the run, like Whitey Bulger. They die of disease contracted in prison. Like Al Capone, they die alone and forgotten, their families having abandoned them, their organizations having moved on. But John LaRocca died in the manner of a legitimate businessman. Old age, in his own home, family present. The death certificate listed natural causes. There was no autopsy. No federal agents showed up to question the family. It was simply an old man passing away at the end of a long life. The funeral was held at Our Lady of Grace Catholic Church. Where LaRocca had attended Mass for decades, the church was packed. Hundreds of mourners attended, family members, friends, neighbors, and undoubtedly members of the Pittsburgh crime family and representatives from other families. The funeral mass was traditional. Prayers were said, eulogies were given. He was remembered as a devoted husband, a loving father and grandfather, a pillar of the Italian-American community, a successful businessman. There was no mention of organized crime. Of course, that wasn't how things were done. The FBI knew about the funeral but didn't make a scene. No obvious surveillance, no photography of the mourners. They had enough photos of Pittsburgh family members anyway. And creating a spectacle at a funeral would have been bad public relations. LaRocca was buried in a Catholic cemetery with full rights of the church. His gravestone was simple and dignified. No massive mausoleum, no ostentatious display, even in death. John LaRocca maintained his preference for staying out of the spotlight. The obituaries in the Pittsburgh newspapers were brief and gave little detail about his life. They mentioned his birth in Italy, his immigration to America, his family, his death. They listed survivors. They gave the funeral arrangements. That was all. For a man who had controlled a criminal organization for 3 decades, who had attended the Appalachian meeting, who had been questioned by the Senate, who had fought deportation proceedings, who had built an empire spanning multiple states, the public acknowledgement of his passing was remarkably minimal, which was exactly what LaRocca would have wanted. To understand why John LaRocca succeeded where so many others failed, we need to compare him to his contemporaries, the other famous mob bosses of his era. Al Capone, perhaps the most famous gangster in American history, ruled Chicago during Prohibition, making millions of dollars and becoming a household name. He loved publicity, courted the press, and lived lavishly. He was eventually convicted of tax evasion in 1931 and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was released in 1939, his body and mind destroyed by syphilis contracted years earlier and left untreated. He died in 1947 at age 48, a broken shell of the powerful man he had once been. LaRocca outlived Capone by 37 years. Capone had been a storm, a man whose flamboyance and hunger for recognition lit up Chicago like a wildfire, consuming everything around him until even his immense power could not shield him from the consequences of recklessness. LaRocca, in contrast, was the still water beneath the storm, moving quietly, leaving barely a ripple on the surface. While Capone's life was measured in headlines, indictments, and public spectacle, LaRocca's life was measured in years, in calm, in the subtle accumulation of power no one saw coming. In the theater of organized crime, he had chosen the role of the invisible puppeteer, pulling strings from the shadows while the world marveled at the chaos of the loud, the flashy, and the reckless, while Capone's love of publicity made him a target. LaRocca's love of privacy made him invisible. Vito Genovese, one of the most powerful New York bosses, spent decades rising through the ranks, briefly fled to Italy to avoid murder charges, returned to take control of his family. He organized the Appalachian meeting where LaRocca was present, but Genovese's ambition led to his downfall. He was convicted of narcotics trafficking in 1959 and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He died in prison in 1969 at age 71, still trying to run his family from behind bars. LaRocca outlived Genovese by 15 years, where Genovese's ambition propelled him into constant conflict and scrutiny. LaRocca's genius lay in understanding that true strength came not from dominating others visibly, but from shaping outcomes invisibly. He operated like a ghost within a world of wolves, aware of every predator, every danger, every opportunity, and never once stepping into the line of fire unless absolutely necessary. Each decision was a calculated move on a chessboard no one else fully understood, and every advantage was leveraged not for ego but for survival. In the end, while others fell under the weight of their own overreach, LaRocca endured, quietly steering the Pittsburgh family through decades of uncertainty with the patience of a man who knew that time. Not force was the ultimate weapon. Carlo Gambino, perhaps the closest comparison to LaRocca, was the boss of New York's largest crime family from 1957 until his death. Like LaRocca, Gambino preferred intelligence to violence, kept a low profile, and built a sustainable criminal organization. Gambino died of natural causes in 1976 at age 74. Having avoided prison but having faced constant prosecution and investigation throughout his career. LaRocca outlived Gambino by 8 years. Both men understood the value of discretion. But Gambino operated in New York, where the scrutiny was much more intense. John Gotti didn't become boss of the Gambino family until after LaRocca's death. But he represents the opposite of LaRocca's approach. Gotti was flamboyant, loved publicity, dressed in expensive suits, held court in public places. The media dubbed him the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don for his early ability to avoid conviction. But Gotti's love of attention eventually destroyed him. He was convicted under RICO in 1992 and sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 2002 at age 61. Gotti's approach, everything LaRocca avoided, led to his early death in a prison cell. From the comfort of his invisibility, LaRocca could watch the spectacle of bosses like Gotti and Capone burn and fast, their energy spent on the chase for fame, respect, and notoriety, only to collapse under the weight of their own ambition. He had learned early on that the world of organized crime was littered with the remnants of men who underestimated patience, restraint, and subtlety. Every headline, every flashy gesture, every show of bravado was a trap. LaRocca's brilliance was not in conquest, but in survival, in quietly shaping the landscape without ever revealing the hand that moved it. Paul Castellano, Gambino's successor as boss, was murdered in 1985, just a year after LaRocca's death, in a famous hit outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. John Gotti had ordered the killing as part of his own rise to power. Castellano's murder showed that even bosses who tried to maintain some discretion could be vulnerable to ambitious underlings. What made LaRocca different? Several factors. 1. Discipline. LaRocca enforced strict discipline on himself and his organization. No flashy displays of wealth, no unnecessary violence, no publicity-seeking behavior. This discipline meant that the Pittsburgh family rarely attracted the kind of attention that brought down other organizations. 2. Patience. LaRocca was willing to build slowly and steadily. He didn't need to be the biggest, richest, or most powerful. He was content to maintain a profitable regional operation rather than trying to build a national empire. 3. Relationships. LaRocca understood that alliances were more valuable than dominance. His relationships with Gambino, Bruno, Bufalino, Trafficante, and others provided protection and opportunities without the risks of trying to control everything himself. 4. Intelligence over violence. While LaRocca was certainly capable of ordering violence when necessary, he saw it as a last resort. Most problems could be solved with money, diplomacy, or strategic patience. This meant fewer murders, fewer investigations, fewer opportunities for law enforcement to build cases. 5. Compartmentalization. The Pittsburgh family's operations were carefully structured so that no single person knew everything. This limited the damage any informant could do and made investigations more difficult. 6. Location, Pittsburgh, while a significant city, wasn't New York, Chicago, or Las Vegas. The level of federal attention was lower. The opportunities for publicity were fewer. This allowed LaRocca to operate with less scrutiny than bosses in larger cities. 7. Timing. LaRocca came to power in 1956, after the most violent periods of mob history, but before the most intense period of federal prosecution. He built his organization during a relatively stable period and maintained it through the more difficult years that followed. 8. Luck. Let's not discount the role of luck. LaRocca avoided several potentially disastrous situations: the Appalachian Raid, deportation proceedings, serious health problems, through a combination of skill and good fortune. But above all, LaRocca succeeded because he understood the fundamental principle that eluded so many other mob bosses. The goal isn't to be famous or feared. The goal is to survive and prosper. Everything else is ego, and ego gets you killed. After LaRocca's death, Michael James Genovese officially became boss of the Pittsburgh crime family. Genovese had been groomed for the role, understood LaRocca's methods, and initially tried to maintain the same approach: quiet operations, no unnecessary violence, steady profits, low profile, for several years. This approach continued to work. The Pittsburgh family under Genovese remained profitable and relatively free from major prosecutions. The organization that LaRocca had built continued operating much as it had under his leadership. But the world was changing in ways that even LaRocca's careful planning couldn't have fully anticipated. Federal prosecutions were evolving into meticulously engineered campaigns of surveillance and forensic accounting. Technologies and tactics that would have seemed almost science fiction to the mob bosses of earlier decades. Youngsters raised in relative comfort lacked the respect for discipline and caution that LaRocca had instilled. Eager to make their mark quickly and loudly, even the city he had carefully curated, the empire he had nurtured, began to shift beneath him. While he had foreseen much, he could not fully foresee a new era in which the very lessons he had taught, discretion, patience, loyalty, would be overlooked by the restless hands now trying to grasp what he had built. The 1980s and 1990s saw an unprecedented federal assault on organized crime. RICO prosecutions became more sophisticated. Informants became more common as high-ranking mobsters decided that cooperation with law enforcement was preferable to life in prison. Electronic surveillance technology improved dramatically. The FBI dedicated enormous resources to destroying the American Mafia, most devastatingly. Younger generations of mobsters didn't have the discipline that LaRocca had enforced. They had grown up in relative prosperity, hadn't lived through the violent wars of the 1920s and 1930s, didn't remember the lessons that LaRocca had learned. They were more likely to use violence recklessly, more likely to seek publicity, more likely to inform on their colleagues when facing prosecution. The Pittsburgh family began to fracture. The fractures began subtly, like the first hairline cracks in an aging foundation. Missed payments, whispered disagreements, minor betrayals. They were small, almost imperceptible, but cumulative over time. The cracks widened, revealing vulnerabilities that LaRocca had so carefully hidden. Ambition, impatience, and the lure of fast profits tugged at the younger members, pulling them away from the slow, steady path he had taught. They ignored the cautionary tales of their predecessors, blind to the truth that in the shadowy world they inhabited, one reckless move could undo decades of carefully built stability. The drug trade, which LaRocca had largely avoided, understanding that drug trafficking brought severe federal penalties and was disfavored by the commission, became a major source of income for younger members. This brought intense federal attention. In 1990, Michael Genovese was convicted of racketeering and drug trafficking and sentenced to federal prison. Other high-ranking members were also convicted. The organization that LaRocca had carefully built began to crumble. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, The Pittsburgh crime family continued to decline. More convictions followed. The leadership became unstable. The younger generation lacked both the discipline and the connections that had made LaRocca successful. The careful network of alliances that LaRocca had built weakened as other families faced their own prosecutions and internal problems. Today, the Pittsburgh crime family still technically exists, but it's a shadow of what it was under LaRocca. Law enforcement estimates that it has fewer than 50 made members and associates. Its operations are limited and constantly under investigation. It lacks the political connections, union influence, and stable leadership that characterized the LaRocca era. But LaRocca's 30-year reign remains legendary in organized crime history. When mobsters talk about the good old days, when they reminisce about bosses who knew how to run an organization properly, LaRocca's name comes up. He's remembered as one of the last of the old-school dons. A man who understood the real rules of the game. His legacy isn't just in Pittsburgh, across the country. Organized crime figures who study their own history learn about LaRocca as an example of how to do things right, stay quiet, build relationships, avoid violence when possible. Keep discipline, think long-term, don't let ego destroy what you've built. The irony is that LaRocca would probably be appalled by his legendary status. He spent his entire life trying to be invisible, trying to avoid attention, trying to stay out of the history books. He succeeded during his lifetime. Most Americans have never heard of him. But within the world of organized crime, his reputation has only grown since his death. What can we learn from the story of John LaRocca? Obviously, we're not advocating for a life of crime. LaRocca was, by any moral standard, a criminal who caused harm to his community. People lost money to his gambling operations. Borrowers were trapped by his loan sharking. Unions that should have served workers were corrupted to serve mob interests. His success came at others' expense, but from a purely strategic standpoint, LaRocca's approach offers lessons that extend beyond organized crime. 1. Silence is power. In a world obsessed with self-promotion and publicity, LaRocca understood that sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody knows about. While others sought fame, he sought invisibility, and that invisibility protected him for 3 decades. 2. Patience beats ambition. LaRocca was content to build slowly and steadily. He didn't need immediate gratification or dramatic expansion. He played the long game and outlasted more ambitious rivals. 3. Relationships are currency. LaRocca's network of alliances was more valuable than any amount of money in a world where trust was scarce. Being known as reliable and loyal made him indispensable to other powerful figures. 4. Violence is expensive. Every murder, every act of violence creates problems, investigations, revenge, attention. LaRocca understood that violence should be a last resort, used sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. 5. Discipline is strength. The Pittsburgh family's discipline under LaRocca: no flashy behavior, no unnecessary risks. Strict operational security made them nearly impossible to investigate successfully. 6. Sustainability beats glory. LaRocca didn't try to build the biggest criminal empire. He built a sustainable one. And that sustainable operation outlasted more glorious but fragile organizations. 7. Know your limitations. LaRocca recognized that Pittsburgh wasn't New York. He couldn't be as powerful as the New York bosses, and trying to compete with them would have been disastrous. Instead, he focused on being the best boss Pittsburgh could have, given its size and circumstances. 8. Adapt to survive. When prohibition ended, LaRocca adapted. When federal pressure increased, he adapted. He wasn't rigid in his methods. He was flexible in service of his ultimate goal: survival and prosperity. 9. Succession matters. By grooming successors and ensuring smooth transitions of power, LaRocca maintained organizational stability. Compare this to families torn apart by succession disputes and internal wars. 10. The end matters as much as the beginning. LaRocca didn't just rise to power. He maintained it for 3 decades and died peacefully. In organized crime, this was a rare and remarkable achievement. The ultimate lesson from LaRocca's life is this: in any competitive environment, especially one with high stakes and significant risks, the loudest voices don't always win. Sometimes the person who survives the longest, who plays the game most carefully, who understands that the goal isn't glory but longevity, emerges as the real winner. LaRocca had never needed recognition or applause to validate his life. His triumph was silent, measured in the quiet victories that no one else could see. Family intact, organization intact, and a freedom few others in his world ever experienced. Every flashy rival who sought headlines, who courted attention and danger, eventually crumbled under the weight of their ambition. LaRocca's reward, in contrast, was the luxury of watching the world move around him while he remained untouched. The master of a domain built not on spectacle, but on patience, strategy, and foresight. A life lived in the shadow of others, yet profoundly victorious in the measure that truly mattered: survival, stability, and peace. John LaRocca was never the most famous mob boss. He was never the richest or the most powerful. He never appeared on magazine covers or became the subject of major Hollywood films. Most Americans have never heard of him, but he died in his own bed at age 82. Having ruled his organization for 30 years without a major prison sentence, without being betrayed, without being murdered. By the only metric that ultimately matters, survival, he was one of the most successful mob bosses in American history. The story of John Sebastian LaRocca is in many ways the story of the road not taken by American organized crime. Imagine if Al Capone had followed LaRocca's approach instead of courting publicity and living lavishly. What if he had maintained a low profile, lived modestly, avoided unnecessary violence? He might have ruled Chicago for decades, dying peacefully in his bed instead of dying of disease contracted in prison. Imagine if John Gotti had learned from LaRocca, instead of seeking media attention and holding court at the Ravenite Social Club. What if he had operated quietly, avoided the spotlight, maintained strict operational security? He might still be alive today, enjoying his grandchildren instead of dying in a prison cell. But they didn't follow LaRocca's approach. Few did. Because LaRocca's approach required something that many mob bosses didn't have: the discipline to forgo ego gratification for long-term survival. In the end, organized crime in America destroyed itself. The FBI's RICO prosecutions were certainly important in bringing down the Mafia. But equally important was the Mafia's own self-destructive tendencies: the violence, the publicity seeking, the lack of discipline, the willingness to inform on colleagues to avoid prison time. The crime families that lasted longest were the ones that followed, even partially, the LaRocca model: quiet operations, limited violence, strong discipline, sustainable business models. The families that collapsed quickly were the ones that did the opposite. Today, the American Mafia is a shell of what it was during LaRocca's era. The great bosses are gone, dead, in prison, or in witness protection. The organizations they built have been dismantled or reduced to insignificance. The next generation didn't learn the lessons. They didn't have the discipline. They didn't understand that silence was power. But in Pittsburgh, in certain Italian-American neighborhoods, there are still old-timers who remember Big John LaRocca. They remember him not as a criminal, that subject isn't discussed, but as a man who commanded respect, who took care of his community, who valued loyalty and honor. They remember him attending church on Sundays, eating at the local Italian restaurants, walking through the neighborhood, always respectful, always dignified. They remember him as a successful businessman, though they might not have known exactly what business he was in. They remember him as a man who understood that power doesn't need to announce itself, that strength doesn't need to be displayed, that the most dangerous people are often the quietest. John Sebastian LaRocca, born in a small Sicilian town in 1901, immigrated to America as a child, worked in the coal mines, served time in prison, rose through the ranks of organized crime, became boss in 1956, attended the Appalachian meeting, survived deportation proceedings, ruled for 30 years, and died peacefully in his own bed in 1984. Was the most successful mob boss you've never heard of. And that's exactly what he wanted, in a world where everyone seeks the spotlight, where success is measured by fame and recognition, where publicity is pursued as an end in itself. John LaRocca proved that there's another way. Sometimes the best strategy is to stay in the shadows. Sometimes the most powerful position is the one nobody sees. In the world of organized crime, where violence, reputation, and ego often dictate outcomes, LaRocca's lesson was radical in its simplicity. Power does not need to be seen to be absolute. Influence moved quietly, in gestures, whispered arrangements, subtle favors, and unspoken understandings. The strongest men were not the ones whose names filled newspapers, but the ones whose presence was felt in every quarter, every decision, every connection, without ever drawing attention to themselves. LaRocca had built an empire of whispers, a kingdom of discretion, and a legacy measured not by notoriety, but by the simple, extraordinary fact that he had lived, thrived, and died on his own terms, leaving the world none the wiser to the breadth of his control. Sometimes the real victory is simply outlasting everyone else. The silent Godfather spoke volumes by saying nothing at all. His empire was built on whispers, not shouts. His power came from discretion, not display, and his success was measured not in headlines or infamy, but in the simple fact that he lived a long life and died on his own terms. In the violent, chaotic, ego-driven world of organized crime, John LaRocca accomplished something almost impossible. He won by being invisible. And that's the incredible true story of John Sebastian LaRocca, the silent Godfather who ruled Pittsburgh for 3 decades and died peacefully in his bed. Something most mob bosses only dream about. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Mafia's most fascinating and overlooked figures, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We bring you the most detailed, well-researched gangster stories, perfect for late-night listening or falling asleep to. Hit that like button if you learned something new tonight, and drop a comment telling me, what other mob boss should I cover next? Who's the most underrated gangster in history? And before you drift off to sleep tonight, remember LaRocca's ultimate lesson. Sometimes the loudest power move is staying completely silent. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most dangerous power is the power you never see coming.